Last week we started a new series entitled But God. And as we sat in Acts 13, the Apostle Paul's first kind of public preaching, we sat in this really beautiful sermon about the whole picture of God's chosen people and their history from the beginning all the way up to the New Testament reality of Jesus dying on the cross. And we saw this moment, but God raised him from the dead. We saw this whole picture that kind of Paul laid out for us. And one of the things that we consistently saw was God's patience, God's mercy, God's undying love for his people, and his saving grace. And so one of the things we sat with was the reality that the Scriptures presented to us was Jesus and God and the Spirit, they're not distant, that they're not disinterested. So often in our bodies and our flesh and our weeks, and I am the chief sinner in this, how often we forget that God both desires and is actively involved in our lives. And that we just have to stop and look for him to see his consistent and constant love in involving himself in the story of the human world. We were reminded that when humans complain, God still rescues them. We saw that after they mess up time and time again, that he's present and near. And even when we see humans take the life of Jesus to beg for his death, to long for his death, that God in himself, he forgives, he renews, and he saves humanity. Hence, we see but God moments everywhere. And I loved a couple of conversations I got to have this week with some of you about how you're looking for these moments now. You're trying to be more aware of how God is working in your lives. I know that that's a gift to us, to be able to look back at circumstances, but also looking in present of how is God involved? How is God involving himself in my life and in ours? So this morning we're going to unpack the story of Joseph. For those of you who know this story, your brain just kind of went, oh, Matt, that's 14 chapters, and we have to get out of here by 11 o'clock. So that's not going to work, and we are not going to unpack 90 years, maybe 93 years of history this morning, I promise you. But we actually are just going to listen in on 7 verses. But I do, even though we're going to be skipping over a lot, what I want to do is I want to take a kind of an edited Cliff Notes version of Joseph's life, talk a little bit about Jacob, his father, and kind of see how we see this ending part of Joseph's story and how God works through it. Does that sound good, everyone? Can we do that? Fantastic. Then let's pray and get to work. Father, Son, and Spirit, we know you're here. We know you're present. We want to pay attention to you. God, thank you for your grace and your mercy. Thank you that you forgive us. Thank you that that's true and that's on offer for us. Thank you that we can sit with the Scriptures, 1 John 1:9, and remember that if we confess our sin, you are faithful to forgive us. We love you. We trust you. Speak to us today. Move in us today. And all God's people said, amen. We'll be in Genesis 50, the latter part, in a minute. But before we do, a little bit about Joseph's life. His story starts in chapter 37, and we see him right at the beginning of the story, although there's a little hint of him before, obviously, because he was born. He starts about age 17 in chapter 37, and he's born to Jacob and Rachel. He's one of the 12 sons of Jacob. For some of you who are wondering where we're at in the overall story, Joseph's father is Jacob, Jacob's father is Isaac, and Isaac's father is Abraham. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So some of you going, oh, okay. Some of you going, oh, I know where we are. So that's where we are. As we read along in Joseph's story, which is not just Joseph's stories, we see that Jacob actually takes extra affection on Joseph. Jacob had Joseph at a much later time in his life, but you see this kind of favoritism toward Jacob. I'm going to do it again. Jacob's favoritism towards Joseph quite often. So much so we see a story where he gives him this coat of many colors. Does anyone remember the story from... all right, this is my kid's favorite story, one of their favorite stories, so I always love reading about it. He gives him this extravagant gift. And this obviously, it promotes or brings up in the brothers' jealousy, all these other brothers that are around. And the brothers' feelings, they're even more provoked as we read on, that Joseph eventually tells his brothers of this dream that he has. And it's one of Joseph's gifts, that he has dreams and he's able to interpret them. We'll see that a little later. But we have this kid who's kind of the favorite of his father, and he's been given this coat, this extravagant coat, this gift. And then, to exasperate it even worse, Joseph at a certain point goes to his brothers, "Hey guys, guess what? I had a dream about you." And they're like, "Oh, really? Tell us about it." He's like, "One day you all are going to bow down to me." Okay, anyone here have an obnoxious younger sibling? A couple. Oh, yeah. Okay. There we go. It's fair. I was the obnoxious younger sibling. So my sister's 10 years older, my brother's 8. I don't think they watch these, but if they do, love you, Greg and Jill. Sometimes little siblings just do stupid things, and they just say things. And if you're the obnoxious little kid, you weren't around for the firstborn, you weren't there. And so that sometimes kids do stupid things. It's okay. So you get it. You get the kind of the picture here. So one day, the father, Jacob, instructs Joseph to go visit his brothers who were tending sheep. And so little did Jacob know at this point that as he sends Joseph off to the sheep fields and to see his brothers, this is the last time he'll see his son for 22 years. So that's kind of where we are in the story. Something tragic is about to happen, something that is human and broken and messy, and we see evil involved in the world and humans partnering with evil. And so as Joseph obeys his father and he goes and he approaches his brothers, they're actually conspiring, some of them are conspiring to kill him because they just hate him, and there's jealousy and selfishness and all kinds of things going on in them. So seizing their chance, the brothers see Joseph and they throw him into this empty pit. Your Bible might say cistern, but this hole that was kept for water, it's empty, and they throw him in the pit. They're having a meal, and as they're having a meal and trying to figure out what to do, they see some travelers passing by. And instead of killing him, the brothers sold Joseph to traders. And so he was eventually, in the story we see, he was brought to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar, one of the king Pharaoh's captain of the guards. And so believe it or not, even in this 4 or 5 minutes, we're actually only at the end of chapter 37 of Joseph's life. There's a lot that's happened. So here are the highlights, a couple of them, to give us kind of the context of the story before we get into chapter 50. So in Genesis 39, so Joseph has left his land. He's been brought into Potiphar's house inside Egypt. We see later that he's there for about 11 years. So he's captive underneath this master Potiphar for 11 years. In Genesis 39, we see that Potiphar's wife at a certain point decides to make an advance. Bless you. Make an advance at Joseph. And Joseph, rightly in the moment, kind of denies her. In running away, he leaves his coat. And Potiphar's wife decides to say, "Hey, you know what? Joseph tried to sexually assault me." And that doesn't usually end up well for people. And so Joseph is put in prison. So we see that in chapter 39. In chapter 40, Joseph finds himself in prison. And at one point, because of God's favor, we're going to talk about that later, he's put in the care of some of the prisoners by the prison warden. God's, again, giving him favor. So he's in prison, he's taken care. And so Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, so the person who does a great job, I'm sure some of you would like this, they would be the one that would test the wine before the Pharaoh would have it. Now, the risk is you might die, but the positive is you taste some good wine. So at one point, the Pharaoh gets really mad at his baker, his chief baker, and his chief cupbearer, puts him in prison. Guess who's in the same prison? Joseph. And so they're thrown into prison, and before the cupbearer and the baker were released, Joseph, he interprets some dreams for them. And again, he's using the gift that God's given him. He interprets these dreams, and as they go, he turns to the cupbearer and he says, "Hey, please remember me as you get released from prison." They don't remember him. Genesis 41, a couple of years later, so this is even more time, the Pharaoh has this devastating dream, and he sees this really strange kind of thing. And as they can't figure out what it is, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. And he remembers the dream. And not only does he remember the dream, but that Joseph correctly interpreted that dream to the cupbearer and to the baker. And so he gets him out of prison. So Joseph's brought to the Pharaoh, and he interprets this dream. And the dream ends up being about 7 years of feast, 7 years of plenty, and 7 years of famine. And so there's a lot of fear. And so in that, we see over the next several chapters that Joseph's actually put in charge of gathering the grain in the abundant years to prepare for the famine years. So he's released from prison. He found favor in prison. Then he's released, and in the story we start seeing there's still mess, there's still brokenness, but Joseph's both in his who he is as a human and his gifting, he's finding favor with Pharaoh. And so he's put in charge of gathering all this grain and storing up for this coming famine. And so eventually he's put in second command in all of Egypt, a Hebrew in Egypt. And so what we see there is as the famine strikes, people from all nations, including Joseph's brothers, come to Egypt to buy food from him. There's a lot going on in chapters 42 through 45, but basically Joseph's brothers don't recognize Joseph. And Joseph decides to test them to see if they've changed, if their characters change. And so after some tests, Joseph gives his brothers, he comes to them and he sees that they've grown in sacrifice, they've grown in humility, and there actually ends up being reconciliation in chapter 45. Joseph forgives his brothers for what they've done. It's a really powerful chapter, and I really encourage you, if you have any time this week, I know it sounds like a lot, but it's just 14 chapters, and even if you spread it out over a few days, you'll see this just incredible mess and how God works in it and how humans fall down and get picked back up and even fall down again. And so it's worth saying that I've skipped over so many elements of the story. And so, again, take some time. You'll see God's incredible favor over Joseph. But where we're going to be right now, then we're going to pick it up in verse 15 of chapter 50. And Joseph's father has actually died. So in the first part of chapter 50, there's this whole thing about Joseph talking to the Pharaoh about going to bury his father in the land of Canaan. This was the promise, and then Pharaoh sends him with men, and they have this whole time to mourn. And so we're going to pick up in verse 15, this engagement between the brothers now and Joseph. A reading of the Lord. Chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brother saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" Verse 16. So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servant of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. So after Jacob's death, their fathers died, Joseph's brothers fear that even though they had reconciliation with their brother, so they've had years of relationship at this point. Years of relationship. I'll tell you a little bit about that. In fact, it's about 17 years' time between chapter 45 and reconciliation and Jacob's death. 17 years. I don't know about you, but if you've been in a relationship before and you've done something wrong or someone's done something wrong to you, and you've done the work of forgiveness and reconciliation, which is not always just one conversation. Sometimes there's work and there's pain and suffering. It's not that it's not hard, but the idea that 17 years later there would still be this lurking thing of like, well, it's a hard thing. And Joseph, he weeps. He weeps. And so the brothers are like, he's going to seek vengeance over us. And the brothers, they send a message to Joseph. They don't even go in person. They send a message. It makes sense why verse 17 tells us that Joseph wept. Joseph is heartbroken in this moment. He is deeply saddened that despite years of reconciliation and kindness, this isn't just, again, it's not just, I forgive you guys, see you later. It's right relationship again. It's building trust again. And so Joseph's heartbroken. He's like, do you really think that my plan is to, after I've fed you and I've taken care of your kids, there's all these stories about him providing for their children, like that you really think that I would do that? He's brokenhearted because his brothers still fear that he's going to take revenge for the wrongdoing. So his tears reveal his pain at being misunderstood and his profound desire to assure them of his heartfelt forgiveness. As I was sitting with this week, it was actually after a conversation with Adrian about something completely different in my own life. And as I sat and I was meditating on what Adrian and I talked about, I started thinking about this story of Joseph, and I was thinking about how there's times we're like the brothers in this. And that I am. I started with myself. I was like, I've behaved this way before with God. Do we fear that God has not really forgiven us? The gift of being our church is that I know a lot of you, and I know you've struggled with this. Some of you have told me that. I know I have. Has God actually done the thing he said he was going to? Is there actually forgiveness? Or do I need to keep coming back and going down the list and going, are we okay? Or are you going to bring vengeance someday on me? Like, this is what's going on. The brothers send a message to Joseph instead of going in person, just as we might feel too ashamed to come near to God or to believe that God has really forgiven us for all wrongdoing. We behave like the brothers all the time in many different ways. And whether we're conscious of it or not, we're afraid to come near to God because we're not totally sure in that moment if he's actually good and he's actually who he says he is. Men and women, it's not that sin doesn't matter. It absolutely does. It's just that but God moments matter more. That's one of the great gifts of learning to be near Jesus and learning to grow in faith as you start to see the reality that sin and brokenness and evil matter so much to God that he enters the story to take on that death onto himself into the grave, conquering the grave because it does matter that much. So that in humanity, as we continue to struggle, he can keep showing up with but God moments and saying, okay, I see what you're doing here, but this is the way of new life. This is the way of abundant life. So that we actually have the Spirit alive in us so we can learn new patterns and learn new ways of being. 1 John 1, we read it all the time. We're going to read it next week together at the top of the gathering. 1 John 1 tells us if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive. Let's keep going. Verse 18. His brothers then came. So they send word. They're trying to check in a little bit. And then, verse 18, his brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. They shout out, "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to him. His brothers come to him and throw themselves at his feet. But the truth is that Joseph had time and presence with the Lord to have perspective. One of the things we can miss in this in Scripture sometimes, and this is why studying of context is so good and important, is we can kind of see this moment, and if we read it quickly, we can think, oh, Joseph's just being, he's like, yeah, you're fine. I forgive you. Joseph's had 17 years. Not just 17 years since reconciliation. He's had 22 years before that. 17 years to 39 years, and then 39 to however long. So he's had tons of years to sit with the pain. He's had tons of time to sit and have conversations with the Lord. He's had tons of times that I know you and I have all had when we're trying to forgive someone and bitterness creeps in. And one day you're saying, I forgive them. The next day you're saying, I'm going to go kill them. Like he's had that time to grow and have perspective and to sit with the Lord. Joseph knew God's sovereignty. Joseph knew God's sovereign. So God is sovereign. We've talked about this before. He's powerful over all. We believe that at this church. We just believe that God at different times gets to exercise his sovereignty how he wants. He gets to define how his power is used. And so Joseph knew God's sovereign ability to bring good out of evil. It's really important that you hear this from me, and I want you to study it yourself. Some people preach this as, you intended harm for me, but God intended it for good. That God from the beginning of time partnered with evil and ordained that Joseph would be kidnapped and brutalized and in prison. And that's just not what the text says or reads. But what it is powerful, that God in his sovereignty looks and goes, I can do something with it, and I will do something with it. And so one of the things that we see is that Joseph understood that his brothers acted with free will, intending harm, but God used their actions to accomplish his purpose, demonstrating divine providence over human disobedience. This is one of the most important things that we have to keep wrestling with in this life. And it causes us, in my opinion, to be active in the faith. There's a line of thinking that goes around that, well, because God ordained all of these things, both good and evil, that's how it is. And the Bible just teaches, it's like, no, God's powerful over all, evil's involved, and he's brought the gospel to renew people, new creation, so that new creation will live out new kingdom perspectives and live against evil. And that in that, one of the promises to humans who are now in the new family is that he'll bring about good for the evil that's done to them and the evil that's done around. And so it shows that God is active, he's over and he's in charge, but he doesn't infringe on the free will of human beings. And so this is one of the things that Joseph understands. And so as Joseph not only saw all the ways God gave favor to him over the years, he also saw that God used Joseph to save many, including his brothers. So please don't hear what I'm not saying. Please don't hear what I'm not saying. This isn't a flippant moment where Joseph goes, oh, that's great. This is real human pain. This is real human years of patience and work and Joseph seeing, but in the perspective, in years, in the forgiveness, in the reality of his dad dying and seeing his brothers, in the reality of seeing the picture as much as he could, he's going, man, you guys were wrong. What you did was wrong. But then I got to see you in how you've grown. There's this whole story about sacrifice. It's a beautiful thing you should read in 44 and 45. And then I got to see in that, looking back, that when all these things were hard, but God was with me the whole way. And I see this. And what led me to this week, men and women, was just this idea that there are those in our past lives, in our future life, and maybe even in our present life that intend to do us harm. That there are actually people out there in our lives that actually don't want the best for us, that actually would enjoy seeing us fail or enjoy seeing us fall. And the reality is that, but God. And that's one of the great gifts of following Jesus, and not just following Jesus in a headspace, but in active relationship, is the ongoing reminder that is the reality, that but God in his sovereignty, in his power, in his promise, he will bring about good for you and for me. See, this is the main difference here. Suffering as a human exists, period. Whether you follow Jesus or not, it's going to happen. The beauty of the promise of as we follow Jesus is that God says one of the things I'm going to do about that is do something with that pain. I'm going to bring good about. And we see this reiterated in the New Testament all the time, but in Romans 8, it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. This is a big, big, big but God moment, men and women. 17 years old, Joseph was almost murdered by his own flesh and blood. That alone. So all the other stuff that happens, I sat with that this week. Just the reality of Joseph knowing that he was almost killed by his own flesh and blood probably would have traumatized most of us for the rest of our lives. But instead, he's sold into slavery and taken away from his home, and he was a slave in Potiphar's home for 11 years. At age 28, he was falsely accused by his master's wife and put in prison. He wouldn't reconcile with his family until he was 39. Again, 22 years without his family. That's a lot of pain. It's a lot of trauma. And one of the things I sat with this week as I meditated was it was a lot of years and opportunity for Joseph to build up bitterness. And when we read the story of Joseph, one of the things I'm constantly reminded of is, Lord, I want that heart. I want that pain and story. But if that's the reality, I want that heart. I want to learn to be so close to you and so identified in you that even when suffering comes, even when intent of harm to me comes, that I'm held in you. I'm not sitting there going, oh, this is great, but in the underneath part of my body and in my spirit, I know that you're doing something with it. It will not be wasted. And that leads me to run away from bitterness, that it leads me to run away from a desire to harm others. But it leads me to Matthew 5, 6, and 7, being a follower of Jesus who pursues his teaching, to love my enemy, to love being meek to the right level of emotion, to be a person who follows Jesus in his ways. God gave him favor. Joseph in prison gave him these opportunities to use his gifts to help other people. And eventually, he was not only able to save the whole environment, the whole country from hunger and death of Egypt, but his own family members. Again, men and women, this is, as we close here, I've got a couple of points I want to point out, but these are big, big God moments. Huge God moments. And it would have to be, because it's a freaking mess. If you read the story of Joseph, you are going to see God's favor, but you are going to see humans do things that are absolutely awful and broken. There's plenty to pay attention to in the life of Joseph. I want to point out three things based on his story, as well as through the lens of the gift for us as the lens of the New Testament. So Joseph doesn't have Jesus. So we have a perspective also that we get to look at through him. So here, if you were taking notes, there are three things I want to point out for us to leave with today. The first is God's purposes are far greater than our own. God's purposes are far greater than our own. God's chukmah, his wisdom, God's foresight, his intentions for your life and for mine far exceed our understanding, our perspectives, and yes, even our desires. So easy for us to live our lives day in and day out with just like, this is what I want to do, and I long for it, and I don't even involve God. I don't involve my community. God can see things we can't. He understands things we can't. He has wisdom beyond our life. He has things he wants to accomplish that are for our good and for the good of all humanity that we don't fully understand. Understanding that God's very heart, God's purpose for us implies that even when personal plans fail for us, even when things that we hold on to that we thought was even our life purpose, when those things fail, God is doing something with the outcome that ultimately aligns with his goodness and his ending desire for your wholeness and my wholeness in Jesus. That is his goal. That we become more and more and more and more like Jesus. To get the hell out of earth. You know how you get the hell out of earth first? You get the hell out of us. You get the evil brokenness out of us. You get us partnering with God and learning to cultivate the heart that God's given us in the new spirit and in the new flesh. Remember, men and women, Philippians 1 tells us, being confident in this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it out unto completion until the day of Messiah Jesus. God's purposes are greater than our own. Second thing I want to point out our attention to is this, and this might be one of the more important ones, but I just want you to write it down if you're taking notes. Number 2, because humans have free will, suffering will occur, but take heart. Suffering is the shaping school. I'm going to read that again. You've heard me say that phrase. I stole it from my mentor, Dane Smith. But because humans have free will, suffering will occur, but take heart. Suffering is the shaping school. James 1 tells us, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. One of the most important things to see in the culmination of Joseph's story is that actually God didn't waste Joseph's pain. As humans, that might be one of the things that we struggle with the most is why? And sometimes we don't always know the answer to why. I've grown as a pastor to enjoy might not be the right word, but feel solidified in sitting with you sometimes and looking at you and saying, I don't know. When the first 10 years of my ministry, I just felt like I always had to have the answer. And I would go read for hours just to, and sometimes I don't know why. But I know that he's doing something with it, and I know that he's going to. If we lean in and we don't seek all the comforts and the numbing things of the reality, or we just lean in and say, well, this is just how it is, and I don't need to do much work, and I've got my ticket to heaven, then in 20 years, you'll look exactly like you did at 40 and exactly like you did at 30. I know a lot of Christians like that who get to their 60s and you're kind of going, how are you not more mature in Jesus? It's because we haven't leaned in and we haven't done any co-laboring work. God didn't waste Joseph's pain, and he will not waste yours. Joseph grew into a great and humble leader, a far, far cry from the obnoxious young teenager that we saw in chapter 37. Through pain and suffering, God shaped Joseph's character to become someone who trusted God and loved others. So, men and women, we can take heart that God has been good. He has a good purpose when he allows us to experience difficult circumstances. It's not wasted. So the first one is God's purposes are greater than ours. The second one is because humans have free will, suffering will occur, but take heart, suffering is the shaping school. And lastly, God is with us. Not only does he do something with the pain, but he doesn't do it from a distance. He doesn't do it as a God disinterested and he's just a little annoyed that we're going through that thing again. He's not the voice in your head going, gosh, Jake, are you serious? Kim, really, we're going through this again? Matt, are we really doing this again? That's not his voice. That's either your voice or it's the voice of the evil one. It's not the voice of your Creator. He's with you, and through the power of the Spirit, he's constantly pointing you back to Jesus. And what is Jesus doing? He's reminding you of the blood. He's reminding you who you belong to. He's reminding you that it's not finished yet. He's reminding you that he's going to complete a work, which then helps us in the moment go, all right, deep breath. Jesus, help me feel renewed. Help me remember that you're not finished with me yet. Holy Spirit, let's go to work in these areas. And that's why our third point is that. It's what a powerful thing for us just to remember that feels basic to say, but is critical for us to remember in our daily lives, that God is with us. If you read through Genesis 37 through 50 this week and you pay close attention, you're going to see that God is not distant, that he's not disinterested in Joseph's life. He's involved and he's at work. And I believe he's at work in our lives as well.